Hello everyone, today we start a series that we were collectively waiting from quite a while because I had announced this, they would come, and some of you at least was particularly enthusiastic to hear it, as I decided to essentially put into YouTube videos my old master thesis that belongs to, sadly, many years ago at this point, and that was actually a fine piece of work. Even though it was not really a particularly innovative research at the time, it produced a 260 pages manuscript. You don't want to know how long the doctoral thesis after this was, but and I will not put that, unfortunately, into video. I used that. First of all, there are different sort of aspects that I would have to explain, because at some point I would like to make videos about my PhD thesis as well. Given its complexity, I discussed that in part. I dedicated a series to that is called like PhD Tales or something like that. And it's not really a thesis to be easily put into YouTube videos, at least not as a series, because it talks about sort of many different things. It's a thematic series. And the master thesis instead was a classically sort of beautiful storytelling of the Battle of what is normally in English called Markfeld, and in German historiography instead Dürnkrutt, and you would say Jedenspeigen, but when I visited the actual town, I asked for directions to some men sitting like at a bar or something, and they said, "Oh, Jedenspeigen." So it's technically Jedenspeigen, at least in the local dialect. In any case, this thesis was very important. Consider that just after a few months, I graduated my master's thesis. I had already got into my research as technically a dependent employee of my university, because I perceived, of course, a scholarship of that Schwerpunkt was born. And those were glorious times for a number of reasons. So in part, you can look at this sort of prehistory of Schwerpunkt, say where it was coming from, probably in the previous year, because it took me an entire year during, however, the last year of master to write this. It took really a lot of work. I had other exams, other classes during my, of course, during that year. And again, I don't want to make a story of that. And again, if anyone is interested in my research, I can continue the doctoral series. But I saw also at the time not so many people watch it, at least recently. At the time, people watched it, but then for some reason, even the phone critic. If you wonder why I stopped, by the way, doing that, I haven't. Of course, stopped it, but momentarily, of course. But it's because, let's be honest, you don't watch that, right? So there can't be all this sort of facade of, okay, but we are here a few people that really love that because we are your most faithful followers. I understand that. But if I don't see some greater, I will talk about von Clausewitz soon. Again, we will also explain properly the concept of Schwerpunkt, which I never really even properly told. I mean, here and there, yes, but I never dedicated a video on. If anything, we have to make this channel work. And I thought that this series is likely gonna get a pretty substantial amount of views. We are in mid-August, people are on vacations normally, so here the views are not particularly high, but they're gonna come back, and I plan on doing, I don't even know how many videos, because I just transcribed the first chapter. I will not be reading it straight away. I will not. It's going to be properly paragraph, say, little sub-chapter by sub-chapter, a video for each, and that is going to take a long time. It's likely that we will not finish this in years, depends on how often I upload the various episodes, unless the cycle intervenes and proposes us properly the Battle of Markfeld, and so at that point I will be able to provide naturally a even more thoroughly intensive and extensive video or videos about that battle, because the sources are really magnificent. The Middle High German, especially the Styrian Rime Chronic, is astonishing. There's so much about this. So this is going to be literally just me reading and commenting on my own literal text. I thought at some point I could read the entire thesis. It's 360 pages. I don't know how, but probably how many videos that would be. I think 5, 6, or even maybe double, because I don't know how here I recompressed everything in a different format. So I can't make the exact math of how long that would be, but it would be just definitely not just a single video. It's really impossible to do so. Anyhow, what I think this series can help us with as far as the channel is concerned is also opening a bit more to that Mytho-European dimension that I often discuss. And I say, I made that my master's thesis was on the Battle of Markfeld, but I never eventually talked so much about, for example, Austrian history per se. I think I made just, as far as medieval Austria, a couple of videos specifically. We talked about, of course, the Empire, Germany as a whole. We talked about Bohemia a lot as well, but we haven't quite focused, and this is the point. I would love to focus way more in depth in basically as far as any topic that we covered already, because believe me, making YouTube history content is not easy at all, in the sense that you never know essentially when it's enough, and it's never enough, in fact, but also you must still be relevant, right? I often start, for example, from the historical regional backgrounds, then we proceed with some sort of military, at least they can't go in different order, but let's say there is a military introduction to different things, battles here and there. But I particularly love also political history, the one of the individual rulers, and a bit that, in fact, kind of sense of authority, of command, of control, strategy. So the bigger picture, which is actually the thing that I learned to research for the first time when writing this thesis. All right, the bachelor one was not bad, was 160 pages, but it was more like, say, browsing, for example, the entire military history of the Longobards from Scandinavia to the end of the kingdom, or their independent kingdom at least. And it was easy to put stuff together, right, and tailor to sew it together and make a general overview. It was also very interesting. I was actually giving a look to this just today of logistics, shifting stuff from disks from databases to apartments, from apartment to another, and more. There is a lot to say about that too. I think we don't talk in depth about the Longobards from like couple of years ago. We had stopped that series, by the way, when we had arrived to the Markfeld, unironically, because these are also more or less the same places where all these events took place. So naturally, I'm very, very attached to this thesis, because it was like such a positive time in my life. I remember when I was writing it, all the issues, let's say, actually, when you look back, you tend to forget sort of the negatives, but it was sort of a glorious moment because I managed to pass the doctoral selection. I had been working at this till the last day, almost because of all the time pressures. There were some bureaucratic issues, a mess, right? I was actually planning to start Schwerpunkt because I said I will not pass my PhD selection, so I have to do something in the meanwhile. It makes sense. And instead, both things happened. I decided later, a few months later, to seriously start a YouTube channel. And what I've written, as well, you will understand this, 260 pages of the thick kind, right? With lots of notes. That's something that I've been also reproached from like a top-tier peer-reviewed journal, like saying, people want to read a bit. Yeah, okay, but if I don't explain why I'm writing what I'm writing in a note, how can people really? There are as you know, publishing houses that do not even want you to put notes into, but those are sort of a different thing. Just yesterday I started writing a book, by the way. So I've arrived to that point where I felt confident enough to really talk a lot and better and in a more articulated and complex fashion about all the stuff that has crazily been happening in the several years from then, and that I've sort of not entirely come out from a mental point of view. And that's why I think this series can be cathartic for me as well, and tie very well into the general picture. Because today I was thinking about, should I make a video sort of talking just about the thesis and why I'm making the video about that, obviously explaining why is this battle important. I presume that you do know. Basically, if we are talking about the Habsburgs in a conventionally sort of popular sense, given their the dynasty's importance in history, it is because of this battle. All right, and it's so important because it happens at the crossroad of so many different European countries, cultures, worldviews, mentalities. Is such a crucial and pretty tormented time, even of what we consider the peak of medieval civilization, especially for Germany, right? And we will partly see this today. And then I realized, well, it's better to cut off like the introductions. If anything, we can talk. If you have any question about that, I can make a side, I don't know, question and answer series about that. And again, not just about I could talk about this thesis, for example, not just the doctoral one, whatever, right? We can resume also Longbird content as well. So again, I thought it's better in this video to stick to the history that is incredibly dense, because I will briefly also explain throughout these videos that I'm of course talking about my master thesis. So there are some things, there aren't actual mistakes, if not typing ones that I remember of, because it was meticulously written, and I mean research, of course, before that. But let's say I will be able to tell you what kind of reflection I was making at the time while I was writing this, because the thing that strikes you, and then I pass to the actual historical content, and this happened to me at different stages in my life, is that you think that the more ahead you go, the better you are, right? Or better. You obviously develop, you grow, right? Today, I think something historically, also thanks to Schwerpunkt, that I wouldn't know at the time, and in a bigger way. But there are still, and exactly because I was actually working with less instruments than the ones that I have today, so to say, an incredible admiration towards my own self, but also I'm not talking just the masters. I remember once I was passing by my old high school on the very street where we used to wait for the school to open in the morning, and it struck me as a vision. This is when I was already at university. It was not even that far from the high school, and I said, and I remembered how sort of hard and primitive my thinking was. Regarding life, studying, how much effort, how much tension before examination, etc. But at the same time, I realized how tenacious and sort of pugnacious I was, exactly because as you're growing up, you're basically building up this armor in fear, and it does cost. It is really something. And then later, you know how to more carefully employ this panoply. And so it's a bit like, it's something you see also in the development of the medieval art of war, right? There is something, of course, less effective about, I don't know, an early medieval army compared to a late medieval one. But because collectively speaking, the latter is much more organized at sort of synergic level. But the individual sort of effort of the more primitive guy is something insane, and just in sheer psychophysical terms, it's something that you greatly admire, also in the measure in which it's lost, right? So for me, it's going to be a bit of a time machine adventure to make this series. I will try to, of course, I will not add other information unless, I don't know, something, of course, that we collected along the way. Will be saying things like, I already made a video about this and that, because I'm going to stick to the history of it. But I will remind you that also in the following videos, this is it. Besides, as I said, this is going to be very long, right? So I will probably frame it like, as you probably can see yourself in the title, the whole thing like, I don't know, Europe at the time of the Battle of Markfeld, or Europe at the time of, I don't know, Rudolf of Habsburg and Ottokar II, Přemysl and Similia, right? There are different sections. And I'll spoiler you a bit the thing that this is just a broader introduction. Then I talk about Rudolf, then I talk about Ottokar, or depending, I don't remember the order, but then I think there is the chapter on the First War, the one 1276, and then all the events basically up to the campaign of 1278, when the Battle of Markfeld was fought, which are dense of events, and I will give especially a lot of background about the respective figures, because they are two clamorous characters in, at this point, late medieval history. It's between high and late medieval, 1250. Then there is a chapter dedicated to the sources that I think may be actually before, and that is also important. That perhaps I will read, because it's more like condensed information. There is something to criticize overall, but it's mostly about the sources as such. Then there is a chapter about the armies of the battle, and so the military cultures that fought at Markfeld, and then there is the actual battle, and then the aftermath of that and the conclusion. It's going to take a long time, also because I condense all the notes, right, and I'll properly order the sources or the translations into it, right? So I will not actually be referring to every single source. We will talk about them. If anything, there is an entire chapter dedicated to that, as I already told you. But as you know, and you could already see how before Schwerpunkt was sort of wired at the time with this hypertrophic historical sort of vision. As also you can understand from the abnormal size of these theses, most people, it's not just that they are like double, the length of a normal thesis, but also of the thick layout type. So it's really enormous. And that's why also with the doctoral one, you would simply get yourself lost into that. I also don't say what that is about, because of reasons, frankly. It's because, as I was telling the other day in this summer backstage episode, there are lots of people that are sort of interested in where I am from and what I've studied further and all this stuff. And so I don't want to give too much information, but I can only say that I use part of that already in my, not much actually. You would be surprised by how few I actually drew from anything I've ever written while making videos, for different reasons. I could do that for articles at this point. I don't know whether it's technically legal, given that I published them, because these theses are public, right? And actually, most articles I published are open source, so technically, also consider that I'm the author of that, and whether. Anyhow, the way I make videos cannot simply be led. It's so original. It's such an original synthesis of everything that you can't basically pinpoint to any specific secondary work. Anyhow, let's get to this, because this is a fairy tale world, right? And the cherry on top of in all this was visiting the Battle of Dürnkruth and Jedenspeigen. We will say Jedenspeigen anyway. Which is beautiful, right? It's also part of a natural park along the Morava River, and it's simply fantastic. I visited also more or less the same time I visited it in July. The battle was in August. But the landscapes are amazing. And you can just imagine, as we'll see now also throughout the specific sources that also visited there from the medieval time, like how it was a pilgrimage for me. In fact, I think that somewhere I'm going to make a video with Tannhäuser's Pilgrimskorps, as that is my music, my song of the battle. And it was really a spiritual experience for me. Also because, and I can say that especially as a specialist in battles reconstruction in my work, that you cannot fully understand that battle until you have set foot on it. It's that battlefield is like an open book. And I discovered something on that battlefield, by the way, that I'm sure, because they never dug into that, and lots of knights died in the Morava trying to cross it. And everything is more or less like it was before, in the course of the river, etc. So if actually I'm one of the few people who ever studied this battle and reconstructed it. So if anybody told me, can you bet where by digging there would be actually a lot of knights fully preserved in the riverbed, I know for a reason where the exact point is. And this is coming from a purely tactical analysis of the battlefield and very specific features that make you understand that's it. That's where it happened. I know that because it's just logical in a military sense. Once you see it, I saw this for an entire year just from Google Maps. And it's only after the thesis, after another year, that I visited the place, and I said, that's the place where, especially the flank attack, the reserve attacking the Bohemians from the flank arrived from. And I think that this is an educational series, historically speaking, because it encompasses the whole experience of research, but it also makes you really participate to the whole. It's the way I wrote this was conceiving this paradox that has always fascinated me, or if a paradox, almost you do you believe in destiny, or do you believe that in destiny can't be properly? Trying to paraphrase Bram Stoker's Dracula, but this means actually something else, that you can actually control destiny. And when you think about old military history and where single battles were fought in places where there is literally nothing. I mean, Bouvines, as in Cook, they have zero there. There's literally nothing, and you wonder, why were these places important? I mean, how is it that such big battles came to be fought there? Besides, Markfield accounts as likely the largest feudal knightly battle ever fought. It's major. And very few people have covered it on YouTube. I was actually shocked to see this, as I was actually shocked to see that the Battle of Tagliacozzo, that is deeply connected with this and was fought 10 years before, and some people that fought at Tagliacozzo fought at Markfield, by the way, is also, I was actually the only person last year to make a video on. I mean, these were by far the single biggest, most politically and military important and historically consequential battles of the Middle Ages, and people do not even cover this, right? But you have, every single battle from the Wars of the Roses, even brawls like covered in detail, right? That's insane. That gives you probably the dimension of the radical underschooling and cultural inferiority of the larger majority of human beings. Like, probably we have failed ourselves. And what you can see on YouTube as a measure of the place where people could create anything, it's really the reflection of this absolute moral, personal, and cultural misery. But that's how I wrote the thesis. Essentially, I start, as you'll see now, from the beginning, from the bigger possible background, right? And then narrowing it down, following literally a path, a pilgrimage, because that's how I conceived that. Reaching the battlefield, right? Throughout, of course, not in material, geographical sense also, studying the campaign and everything, but obviously what had been happening with all the great rulers of the era, of these characters that emerged, for making you see how sort of random even the whole thing, or at least apparently, and truly humanly unpredictable this thing really was. That's the thing that I love the most about this. And honestly, if I read my doctoral thesis of 700 pages, I say, yeah, I love it. It's well written. It's actually the biggest thing I've ever done. It's very useful. I'm basically, until I die, have all the material imaginable to write anything out of that. And so it's my most important asset. But when I read my master thesis, I say, man, I love this. I love the story. I love the picture. I love it. It's just like a fairy tale, really. And it's so gravid with meaning, tradition, symbolism. It really opens your eyes also on what Central Europe was in the late 13th century. It's something really amazing. And it has also a deep moral teaching within it, I would say. That the way this battle unfolded is so... and the whole picture there is almost theatrical. You know that there was also, in the 19th century, that was the age of an opera dedicated to especially Ottokar, right? Gluck und Ende. Some of you asked me some sources, some passages that are beautiful, that are frightening. There is especially, aside from the Steirische Reimkönig, that is the most beautiful source, for reasons that you will fall in love yourself with, as I will tell you, if you're not aware yet. Unfortunately, very few people, because that's also yet not quite fully translated in some more practical language. It was plausibly one of the few people that actually ever published something that brought some actual translation to that. And its author, Ottokar Alstergal, is just like, I don't know, the Austrian Dante of some sort. He worked at the court of Frederick III of Habsburg, the one that was captured by his cousin Ludwig of Bavaria. By the way, they were all grandchildren of Rudolf of Habsburg. And again, we will see this beautifully also, especially at the end. But it's possible that as we have to finish this series, we're going to have made videos, other videos on Markfeld and or this other figures, and that were the protagonists of the same. I was saying, however, that one incredibly beautiful source is a letter sent the winter before the battle from Ottokar to the Poles. And it's beautiful because it speaks essentially in a Slavic fashion, right? You have different sources that Ottokar, was a quite Germanizing ruler in many ways, also because he hated his own national nobility, as normally also in hindsight it was the right thing to do, considering that that's what destroyed the Central European monarchies, including the German one, etc., and Bohemian one. But there is all a different way you write. For example, the German sources are all talking about the Romans. I mean, Rudolf of Habsburg is not just the king of the Romans, but the Germans literally, as a battle cry, say, here's Rome, like we are the Romans of the situation. Feudal stuff, mendicant sources, because that was the specific time. We'll see this also as far as Rudolph's sort of pious background and mythology is concerned. When you read this message between the Slavs, these Western Slavs against the Germans in particular, which is pretty explicitly preferred, you realize an incredibly different set of references and values. The ancestors, the common, this almost tribal background. It opens your eyes about what the radical divide that existed between post-Carolingian Europe and the Slavic world, regardless of the fact that the latter had been heavily Germanized and feudalized by the West exactly at that point. And again, that's how you actually learn history at the end of the day, because there is no other way but to continuously dig into it. But if you don't properly work with it, just reading doesn't actually make it. All right. So that's how I began. And again, it's a huge amount of stuff that, by historical scope and importance, of course, that, however, we all know about also because we made an enormously large amount of videos about. We're introducing the 13th century. Right here I said basically Western Europe witnessed an era of political and cultural brilliance not seen since the Roman Empire. And indeed, I made multiple videos explaining this fact. Many people often think of, say, the Middle Ages as sort of an irreparably dark, backward moment. 13th century Europe, and especially Western Europe, was an utter explosion of civilization that, frankly, I accept perhaps for the Romano-Italic Confederacy of the early centuries before Christ. I do not know any rate of growth comparable to in the entire history of mankind. I mean, the Industrial Revolution, in terms of relative growth to their own society, was nothing compared to this. This was, by scale, something unprecedented in relative terms, and it can't be. You understand, of course, the difference between absolute and relative, because there's obviously going to be the smart ass who say, "But the Industrial Revolution was more powerful than in relative terms." Do you know what that means? And here, of course, I had my own deviant ideas. For example, I said commerce and trade thrived. Today I would say something much more brutally political and institutional about that. Driven by several key developments: the growth of an agrarian economy, the reclamation of undeveloped lands, the transformation, and here I sort of also saw this in perspective from the higher Middle Ages, essentially the transformation of Scandinavian pirates into settled farmers and traders, the end of Hungarian invasions. Hungary will have, as you know, an important place in this series, because not just the Hungarians fought at Markfeld, but also in other engagements against Ottokar. This is a triangle, the Markfeld, because the Mark is the Morava in German. And, this is that at some point it flows into the Danube. Again, beautiful landscapes if you travel there. And it's at the crossroad of Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. Remember, Slovakia was technically Upper Hungary in the Republic. We made lots of videos about that. And there is Germany, so Austria from the other side. And it's beautiful because at some point when the German and the Hungarian armies reconnect, they had been marching in parallel along the Morava, and at some point the Magyars cross into sort of from on the right bank, and there is an actual place there. And I will show you the pictures, by the way, of the road. By the way, Stilfrid is along the way that Rudolf of Habsburg marched towards the battle, and Stilfrid is famously enough a name that comes up because it's just a village there, but where a famous Roman so-called Lorica Segmentata was found. Just imagine, like the fact that the Romans had been up to that point, and also beyond at some point in their expeditions to Bohemia. And so it gives you sort of mounts as a general. I think about the court of Vienna, of the blood court, in the Nibelungen. There is a lot to that. We'll listen to the echoes of that as well. Here was adding, of course, the revival of Italian maritime trade in the Mediterranean. How many videos have we done? Renewed access to the Levant through the Crusades. There is literally a video in which I talk about these two things in tandem. And also here I was saying the enriching impact of Byzantine and Arab cultural influences, which is kind of true, at least considering those civilizations being pretty advanced. Remember, I was talking about this from sort of the higher medieval perspective. And here, so these factors laid the material groundwork for this resurgence. The rising urban estates supported by these developments and the boldness and initiative of their leaders generated considerable prosperity and societal well-being. Yet, and here we fortunately switched to the more interesting aspect, alongside the swift economic progress and the intense competition for newfound wealth, conflicts became more frequent than in the entire previous millennium. This is also true. The fact, and this is actually a very subtle thing that I wrote in this introduction, which again, as I was saying before, it's not like it's lost to my vision, and I often talk about this in my more recent uploads. But the fact that alongside with the development, there is also crisis and tension and conflict and issues and distractions, etc. So this is particularly the case for Germany. In fact, I did very well to introduce the topic through this path, because it highlights how the 13th century, so this actual peak of medieval civilization, witnesses a radical crisis in Germany. And not only, we'll see now why. Here, I was sticking just more to the systematic. I was saying cities located at critical junctures of trade routes, whether on water or land, began to assert their own political agendas. And as we'll see, this is particularly the case for Vienna in the broader picture here of the Battle of Markfeld. And also very antagonistic and antipathetic terms, as a matter of fact, against the same Habsburgs, ironically enough, considering, of course, they would much later become the capital of the same dynasty, pursuing independent expansionist goals that often clash with the interests of dynasts and princes to whom they were nominally subject, thereby fueling the era's political instability. Here, I was also obviously mostly talking about within the Holy Roman Empire, the struggle between the emperors and the communes. All right, and not only, and that's also a topic that we covered abundantly, but never enough. This period marked a departure from the mindset of earlier centuries, not only in commerce and culture, but also in embracing new opportunities with a spirit of independence. Very, very true. Fostering innovative forms of governance and legal systems in the domains of politics and authority. The Bamberger Reiter, right? I want to make a video about that because it incarnates really properly this newfound spirit of entrepreneurship at deep metaphysical levels of the vision of the world, right? This is not an obscure world anymore with sort of looming threats to feel menaced by, but literally like properly the imperial Catholic traditional worldview of molding the universe in your own image through a providential lens. And this will brutally recur in properly the model of leadership that Rudolf of Habsburg incarnated. I'm not even presenting these characters because aside from the fact that there are entire videos dedicated individually to them, and by the way, up to the battle, meaning that I will present Ottokar. I mean, he dies in the battle. Big spoiler, but. And so you can see there more or less his entire life. Rudolf goes on, and mostly this was his greatest achievement, so of course. But it doesn't end there. There's so much about Rudolf's policy, not only in Germany, by the way. If you look also at his son Albert, there is a moment in which the Habsburgs actually, and this is to say how expansive medieval civilization was at this point, was almost controlling like Germany, Bohemia, and Poland, at least nominally, right? There even that kind of claim was because the various noblemen of those countries would also ask for protection in exchange for the recognition of the crown. So it's complex and it's much wider when you actually enter the depths of medieval details. At this point, it's really there, right? The book I started writing the other day starts from this minutiae from exactly the year 1300, and it's mostly almost the same years here. And again, it's fantastic in so many ways to enter properly in the living blood of such such worlds. Then he said, much of Europe's vitality was consumed by internal strife, exacerbated by the ongoing conflict between imperium and sacerdotium, the tension between secular and ecclesiastical power, that, I would better say actually lay and ecclesiastical power, that had fractured Western Christendom since the 11th century. The political disunity of the West, particularly within the Holy Roman Empire, the universal monarchy meant to ensure order and peace across Christendom, was dramatically highlighted by the lack of a coordinated response to the most catastrophic event to strike the continent from the east, the Mongol invasion of 1223-1245. Here I was dramatizing a little because, of course, the Mongols will arrive at the gates of Germany and enter it. They will even cross the Alps at some point, but they were just scouts, right? Reconnaissance parties of sort. Naturally, this is enormously catastrophic for other parts of Central and especially Eastern Europe, And so that's actually true. And so here I was making the point how I was introducing the German situation because, of course, you know, the leitmotif of all this is that Rudolf brings an end to the Interregnum. And so he's the guy. Here I was to contrast essentially the pretty dire situation which Germany, and in many ways it had found itself in already from the late Hohenstaufen era, where much of the Swabian dynasty's power in Germany was basically being eroded, and literally the emperors were selling public rights in exchange for a privatistic base of power, which is essentially also what Rudolf pursues, even though trying to maintain a public one as well. And that's also a very important and fascinating aspect of the thesis that explains how, and you can see it from both sides. I would say that in spite of the fact that, of course, Rudolf felt very much the public office of King of the Romans, the ways eventually the Habsburgic Erbländer were properly settled through the Battle of Markfeld, and they could have been lost, by the way, later on at some point. It was through this essentially privatistic policy, right, that ensured this great dynasty to secure large swathes of the empire. In this case, actually in Germany, but as you know, later with the Luxembourgs, there were a direct response of the Bohemians to call from Lorraine, as you know, against the Habsburgs, and also with the Angevins in Hungary. You know, there are all these kind of, and in Poland as well, by the way. The Angevins are the great enemies of the Habsburgs, also especially within a Mediterranean context. There's so much to say. You have no idea how thick this narration is going to be, but that's the beauty of it. And so I wanted to contrast especially the fact that, of course, the Holy Roman Emperor was to be the most powerful ruler out there, and in many ways, at the time of Frederick II, when the Mongol invasions happened, he was, and there was actually also a response against the Mongols. There was a broader organization, and as you know, the Mongols at some point decide not to go further, not just because they had to fall back properly to Mongolia for political reasons of power succession, or actually also just out of other decisions. But properly, that I made an entire video years ago explaining how the Mongols could have never conquered Europe. I mean, it's just wishful thinking, and this is something better understood when we look at the actual essence of the Mongol army, and not just of medieval warfare as a whole. Of course, that would be enough to answer the question. As I made also tens of videos about the Mongol army that we will also keep discussing as well. And so here I go with the Mongols. I said, originating from the Asian steppes, the Mongols overwhelmed the vast Christianized Slavic territories. This is true. And the measure of, say, that divide that it was highlighting, it still exists today in Europe between West and East, that is way more important than the one between North and the South, was already articulated in the Middle Ages by the possibility of the Mongols to literally cross Poland, Hungary, even enter the Balkans, ravaging Ruthenia, etc., subjugating all those Slavic principalities in the forests in the north. I recently also made a video about the Polish-Lithuanian expansion in Ruthenia, the collapse of the Mongol power at that point of the Golden Horde. Originated from the Asian steppes, the Mongols again overwhelmed the West Christianized Slavic territories, subjugating roughly 3/4 of the Ruthenian principalities and launching devastating incursions into Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, and Bulgaria. We're just reflecting how several years ago just this list of countries would appear in a different way, and from the fashion that, especially through memes, Twitter, etc., like the rehabilitation of this part of Europe is supposed to happen just for, they don't have immigrants yet, as if for the rest everything was fine there. Of course, tradition and rule of law and everything, this is not exactly how it is. Of course, we are incredibly thankful that countries like this are very welcome in the broader West, as they also largely belong to that. Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, Croatia, these are all Western powers. There was a guy, I remember always, I made a video about Greco-Slavic civilization. It was a question and answer video. And in his minds, because this is how far this BS has come, like say, but how can Croatia, Hungary be part of the West? I mean, literally, they were Roman Catholics. They were part of that system. What kind of other indication you have? Of course, they are not Western Europeans, because not even Germans are Western Europeans, but in a broader cultural sense, because really Central Europe is something else. But even though differences existed, just like the ones here in terms of who was overridden by the Mongols in many ways, remember that this system, in fact, was different because one side was hegemonizingly successful over these others, right? One of you asked me, by the way, a Serbian guy, because I recently made a video, other videos about medieval Serbia, say, wait, please talk about the Western influence on the development of Serbian civilization, which is something ideologically sort of apparently opposed by some, at least Serbians. Others, write me, for example, are very much, also because you know that Serbia is eventually to obviously enter the EU, the Eurozone, and it's just an obvious political process. But let's say it is something that has an actual historical root that wants to be sort of ideologically, that some people want to ideologically reject for different reasons. But in any case, let's reflect also what literally was happening in the 13th century to these countries, right? Including Bohemia. That is also as I was saying before, the element that is a bit the jolly here, because it's part of the Holy Roman Empire, technically. And that has issues with this. I made multiple videos about Bohemian warfare that tells you also how relatively late in time, even though they were by far the most westernized of the Slavs, they still had some sort of steppe flavor to them, some lighter type of cavalry, some sort of general proximities, because literally the steppe is there. I mean, the Markfield itself is technically not the steppes climatologically, but geographically, or is the continuation of the wider plain, the event of the Danube, from which raiders of all kind had come from the bowels of reached from the bowels of Central Asia, from ever, like the Cumans, for example, that will participate to the Battle of Markfield from the Hungarian side, also because the king was half Cuman himself. Are also we will talk more about them in a very frequent iconographic presence in German art, especially these Eastern German areas, for obvious reasons, because they literally were next door. I mean, Slovakia is heavily impacted also at an ethnic level by these. You can see it, let's be honest, in the facial skeletons, in the I mean, you realize that literally that's where the steppes begin in many ways. Then here I wrote, forced to confront the Khan's armies in open battle by the Kievan Rus at Kalka in 1231, the Silesian Polish forces at Lenica in 1241, and the Hungarians at Mohi in 241 were unsuccessful. That's also what you really want to mind. Because there was never a fully sort of Western force that actually was crushed at this point. The Silesian Poles had Germans, but there was an idea that, for example, there were an entire Teutonic contingent that also indulged in it at some point. That, however, seemingly was not true. There were surely some Teutonic knights, but they would have been, because Teutonic knights, as we've seen also in recent videos, were relatively errant. They weren't even just properly tied to the Ortenstadt. But in any case, the Mongols were scary at this point, especially because nobody really knew who they were, what they were doing in Europe, right? And the magnificent display of military power and this victory scored by the steppe people on these, at least Central Eastern European forces, was really interesting. Again, made lots of videos, including on the Western explanation on why the Mongols had been successful, mostly from also Western Europe rather than like Central Europe. You can understand better how I sort of resized a bit the Mongol threat, right? Not much their might, because there is no doubt that they were formidable and extraordinary. I also made videos explaining how they contributed properly to the development of the art of war. However, right, we have to be objective about what they could achieve in practice. As I were unsuccessful, resulting in the complete destruction of Christian forces each time. During this invasion, the German Emperor Frederick II was preoccupied with conflicts in Italy. I recently made a video about the siege of Rome by the Stupor Mundi against Pope Gregory IX and the Lombard League. From the latter half of the 12th century, the Swabian Hohenstaufen dynasty, through the reigns of Frederick I, 1155-90, Henry VI, 1191-97, and Frederick, 98-1250, worked tirelessly to restore the Holy Roman Empire's dominance over Europe and the Mediterranean. The last of these emperors, celebrated for his remarkable qualities as the Stupor Mundi, wonder of the world, sought to create a stable imperial foundation in a centralized Italy by combining the authority of German and Sicilian crowns. However, these ambitions faced resistance from the autonomous aspirations of cities, duchies, and kingdoms, which at the peak of their, and I say here again, economic growth, bristled under the empire's centralizing policies. The papacy, which also sought hegemony over the Italian peninsula and feared the Hohenstaufen's threat to its hard-earned privileges in the Patrimonium Sancti Petri gained during the investiture controversy 1075-1122, frequently aligned with these defiant forces. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae, this is a note, but here I will have to find some ways to better integrate this in the text, maybe through some AI or something. In any case, in 1075, Pope Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae banned lay investiture of ecclesiastical offices and proclaimed the supreme authority of the papacy in both temporal and spiritual affairs. At the Diet of Worms in 1076, the Emperor Henry IV declared Gregory VII deposed, while the Pope excommunicated the Emperor and absolved his subjects of their oaths of loyalty. In 1077, Emperor Henry IV was compelled to seek absolution at Canossa. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 between Emperor Henry V and Pope Calixtus II settled the investiture controversy, assigning spiritual investitures to the Pope and temporal ones to the Emperor. I made multiple videos about the investiture controversy. There is an entire playlist if you're interested. We talked about the Council of Sutri was incredibly important, especially at the time of Henry V. I talked about, as far as here we're talking mostly about German history, defeudalization of the German episcopal appointments. That is an incredibly important step in the institutional development of medieval Germany. I mean, the fact that the bishops were properly invested with the same procedure that lay officials were as far as their churches were concerned, which normally wasn't conceived because, the church belonged to the church, not to the bishop. But this tells you the radical level of privatization. It's also, in that sense, as a consequence of the Concordat of Worms, as a German defeat, as a defeat of the Kingdom of Germany and of public authority in Germany, and a consequence of that power destructuration that was also ultimately to cause the collapse in the following century as well. How much we have to talk about German history. And you see that why it is so useful even to start a series like this, because there is so much to tell just about this that never ends. Consequently, Europe split into two major factions. Here I'm skipping, of course, all what was happening in between, because, of course, well, it's fairly well resumed, but there is also the fact that the actual escalation of the Guelph-Ghibelline divide, especially at the international level, started occurring in the second half of the 13th century. And it's not like it will particularly invest Central Europe either, but still, right here, as the Swabians were still involved, and so with the empire, the peak involvement in Italy, like it's important to talk about this because it says Europe split into two major factions known in Italy as Ghibellines and Guelphs. These terms originated from Weibelingen, the Hohenstaufen castle used as a war cry by imperial armies, and Welfen, the ducal dynasty once opposed to Emperor Frederick I. I recently made a video exactly on that topic, more properly the origins of the Welfen. The divisions between Guelphs and Ghibellines crystallized in the second quarter of the 13th century, building upon pre-existing independent rivalries, rendering these alignments highly dynamic and subject to changing political contexts. These groups backed the empire and the papacy respectively. After intense and relentless struggles for control in northern Italy, that of Frederick II in 1250 precipitated the swift decline of the Hohenstaufen dynasty and with it the waning of imperial authority across Europe. This is, by the way, a super broader disclaimer. It's not even properly the introduction I skipped the introduction to the thesis itself that I wrote, but this is just like flashily. What are we talking about, right? And then we'll talk more about the respective context, because eventually I skipped directly to Rudolph and Ottokar, because those are the true protagonists of this clash, and it's important properly to hinge the history of it on them, all right. To prevent a revival of Ghibelline influence, the Pope called upon Charles, brother of King Louis IX of France and Count of Anjou and Provence, the latter being an imperial fief, by the way, who rapidly seized the kingdom of Sicily. In 1266, Charles defeated Manfred, Frederick II's illegitimate son, huge figure. I made a couple of videos only about him, but I have to come back because that's where probably things escalate at an ideological international level, even more than during his father, right? I made a video about the Battle of Montaperti. It is very much tied to that. So the German connections with Tuscany at the time. So in battle, we're talking about the Battle of Benevent, of course. And in 1268, when Manfred died, Charles overcame Conradin, the last of the Swabians, who sought to claim his inheritance after forging a wide network of alliances in central and northern Italy. And again, I made a video, if anything, about the Battle of Tagliacozzo, that the time and meaning of Tagliacozzo, as I was recalling before. I'm literally the only person who made a video about that, explaining the whole deal on YouTube, which is insane, considering, again, this is literally, there are just a handful of battles in Europe that are more important than this, and all the hundreds of thousands of others are next, right? Some of them, again, the major, but for some reason nobody ever made a video about this. Insane. The battle is huge. It's at the same level of Markfield, right? But for some reason, I don't know. It is maybe because they don't find the sources. When I was studying Markfield, I noticed that there wasn't much written about it, and that's also why I wanted to write something about it myself. So this is considered that this is public, but I didn't publish especially my master thesis. It wasn't really you don't do it, right? It's not worth it, especially as you're starting a PhD at that point. But it's public in the sense that the stuff is deposited at university, and it's a public act, so to say, and everybody can access it. But so just to say, you will not find this published out there, nor you will find, because there are other people that I searched just the other day to check this, and that had written about the battle in some more or less, I don't know, it's not even just mostly from a military historical point of view, but just for the broader historical one, right? This is expectedly, for example, a very important battle for, in Czech history. Presumably, again, Slovakia, Hungary will care about this, but in Germany, for example, Austria, they didn't even write so much about it, right? There is something, as we will see now, or at least in other videos, from the 19th century, from late 19th century, beginning of the 20th, but then nothing else until the 1970s. And it's just an article properly about the battle reconstruction that had already been sorted out, however, by those early 20th century sources. And And I added just a few things, honestly, to the wall in terms of original, let's say, discovery or reflection and perspective. Of course, I wrote it in my own way, but let's say we already knew how the battle had gone, right? So there wasn't too much work there. If anything, I noticed that if you search on Google because I was preparing also the images, like so also the battle map, you will find very old dated, very old, let's say better in English, imagery from those early texts that wrote about the battle, some of which were wrong about how it went. It was fought with the various lines of cavalry in depth, right? And in some, fortunately, I don't know whether, let me check if on YouTube somebody made it like that, but I'm pretty sure I saw at some point on YouTube that somebody of the bigger channels even uploaded the wrong version of the battle. And there's no doubt, by the way, and I can absolutely clear any, because I know there are a bunch of people who are passionate about this battle, but they never studied it, so they don't know exactly, even just, they may like the history of it, but say from a tactical point of view, say why would be an army deployed in a way rather than another. Well, I'm here to explain that. It is my job, and we will have definitely a lot of, a good chance to explain this in this case. Conradin. So within 2 decades, just resuming what I wrote, of the Stupor Mundus death, the Ghibelline faction had effectively collapsed, while the Capetian dynasties of France and Sicily established a formidable new Guelph alliance, which, following Charles of Anjou's conquest of Epirus in 1271, stretched from the English Channel to the Balkans. This aspect is crucial. I'm always surprised when you search Angevin stuff on online, on YouTube, whatever. The only thing is the Angevins, meaning literally the English dynasty of Anjou. And literally there is the Angevin, which is called an empire as well. And the actual Angevin Empire, the biggest, the most powerful, the most important, in broader terms, of the French one, is not to be found. Just today I was searching images for Henry IV. To me, is the Holy Roman Emperor. No, there is Henry IV of England. And only that. On Wikimedia Commons, when you search for the pictures, idem. Again, it's weird, but it happens. And this is telling you how radically properly shifted the most probably even the means that you are accessing in terms of references of, just imagine somebody who does not know much about all this stuff and how much they are influenced in believing such enormous, such at least to be presented in a disproportionate way, certain topics that are not even the most important ones. At least if we were to compare, I mean, I'm very far from claiming that, of course, the English Angevin Empire was not important, but let's say, where's the rest? We need the other part. Besides, here I also made an acute point regarding the fact that the Ghibelline bloc had somehow collapsed, and I discussed this if anything, in other videos, mostly in the ones about, in fact, the Angevins, the one on the Taglia, for example, because at that point the Ghibelline faction was mostly like an Italian one, right? You can't properly talk of Guelphs and Ghibellines in Germany. That was mostly like a 12th century thing, if anything. But this is also the problem, because in order to get the imperial crown, you have to come to Italy. And if in Italy there is basically an Angevin hegemony, and the Ghibelline communes are reduced to a few, to a handful of, especially in the northeast, how do you do that? Right? Conradin had, because the same situation had happened after the death of Manfred, right? Conradin had descended into Italy and had received great support after his death, basically until Henry VII of Luxembourg. Because remember, Rudolph never was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. He never came to Italy. He prepared the expedition 4 times, but it was a total mess. We will have a wide chance of discussing with this series happening in Central Europe. that he wouldn't, right? He was king of the Romans, and so that was kind of an equivalent, but of course he never made an expedition. He sent troops to Italy. He supported the few Ghibelline communes here and there, but overall, like, he couldn't do that much. But he was always a step away from, and that's also an underrated aspect of the war. Consider that the series is not going to be a extensive and complete biography of, say, Rudolf of Habsburg, because there is so much to that otherwise we would really have to do. And on Schwerpunkt, we are going, hopefully, to cover, right? It's unbelievable how relevant a ruler of this kind really was. However, it requires really an enormous work to properly address. Continuing with my text, focused on a centuries-long endeavor to bring prosperous Italy under imperial control, the Hohenstaufen allocated few resources to building a robust national German monarchy comparable to those of France or England. Absolutely true. And absolutely underrated, especially in the causes of that, because there are some historians that claim that essentially Germany at some point had, say, by the 11th to 12th century, more or less the same chances to develop into a robust national monarchy like France or England. But it's not really true. Even before the Concordat of Worms, the investiture controversy, Germany had important issues. Right? We're just talking about Carolingian power in Germania the other day, and already highlighting the main characteristics of the Eastern Frankish kingdom that had always had those problems. And the reason why actually fewer resources were allocated to this national state building was that state building in Germany was much less convenient than state building in Italy or Sicily. And this is exactly what the Hohenstaufen did. The 19th century German historiography, especially the more nationalistic leaning, was basically saying the Swabians were more corrupt by the Mediterranean customs. They were purchasing this southern chimera, and they ended wrongly, etc. Aside from the fact that they incarnate pretty well the sort of the tragic fate of the Germanic hero in a grandiose fashion, by the way, all the legions behind the Hohenstaufen. I mean, Germany is in many ways the Hohenstaufen. Whoever, including the Welfen, like Otto of Brunswick, whoever had power in Germany immediately went to Italy. All right, as long as the Hohenstaufen were there, if whoever was there, you were not in charge. You would say, "No, we don't want to send you knights to go to Italy." Then you become king. Okay, let's go to Italy. That's literally it. And naturally expanding the Baltic and the Ostsiedlung, we'll see now also how the Bohemians were doing. I mean, Königsberg is famously named after Ottokar II. Because for Central Europeans, going to the Crusade is mostly a Baltic thing. All right, and so everybody went at some point. It was also closer, and I mean, obviously, it was pretty perilous, even for regardless of the distance. But it was a normal duty, right? But there were much less resources there, so it's obvious that the Germans would go for Italy. It's kind of obvious. It's incredibly rich, incredibly fragmented. What are you waiting for? That's literally, except they failed for other reasons. And the same Germans, in part, did not help the process of monarchic feudal construction, because it was always about those princes eroding. At this point, even the bishops, right, eroded monarchic power for pursuing their own private oligarchic things. Now, and this is the backdrop of it all, because again, until Rudolf, Rudolf's generation, there was the idea, especially of this sovereign, it was incredibly cold and stubborn and iron-fisted to a degree. He destroyed like 70 castles in the Rhineland belonging to rebels. So there was still the idea that what they were doing was public, right? Imperial royal stuff. In the wake of the Hohenstaufen, by the way. I would like to point out that Frederick II was the godfather of the same Rudolf of Habsburg, among the other things. So imagine, oh my God, do you realize what this is? A generation, it's beautiful. It's incredible. And all the hidden meaning and symbolism behind this. So here I was going on, since German secular and ecclesiastical princes exploited the monarchy's weakness to expand their own authority, and the political void left by the Hohenstaufen's fall removed the last barrier to their ambitious expansionist agendas. Lacking strong and authoritative leadership, many German territories descended into violent chaos. This turbulent and uncertain period, known as the Great Interregnum, due to the absence of an emperor, which was not even entirely true, as we will see now, because there were at least kings of the Romans, spanned more than 2 decades, right? 1250, 1273. This is important because, again, Rudolf of Habsburg is not a Holy Roman Emperor, right? There had been already kings of the Romans, namely Alfonso of Castile, Richard of Cornwall, that we also discussed in that recent video about the Battle of Taillebourg. So the Great Interregnum in this didactic kind of scanning, chronological scanning of German history is more to say, well, basically until Rudolf of Habsburg there wasn't properly a strong man, right, in charge, at least in trying to recompose the situation. Indeed, the other rulers in between were weak and were chosen by the German princes exactly for that. So the Great Interregnum is not even this, cataclysmic, apocalyptic end of the world, Germany nuked or whatever. No, it is something that still follows the normal, pattern, unfortunately, of this public disintegration. And of course, there is a mess going. It's definitely not a positive period at all, right? It's just lack of rules, there's violence, there are distractions, wars, etc. But there is still at least an idea that something leaves institutionally through this mess, right? And Rudolf would be there to collect that. And so I say here, initiating an irreversible process of fragmentation and decentralization in the Kingdom of Germany. Well, irreversible maybe is too deterministic, but yeah, kind of. This is how it went down the line, and I would argue it had already started, right, from 1250. If anything, the end of the Hohenstaufen definitely did not help. But also, it's not like Frederick II dies and everything collapses. It takes a while before things shift towards a more definitely provincial, privatized dimension. Still, there is again a kingdom of Germany. There is an emperor at some point. I mean, Henry VII makes it to be crowned in Rome, for example. Is the first one after Frederick II. Not even Conrad IV made it. At least he died after he arrived to Italy fighting with his brother, and I mean alongside his brother. Some say that he also was poisoned by him. Anyway, we're talking Manfred, of course, half brother. In any case, I say the political conflict ultimately centered on 2 figures, and so that's how I paved the way to them, because through them I eventually explained what was happening in Germany better, what was happening in Bohemia better, all right? Also partly in Italy, because Rudolf had been to Italy. He had literally, I think he was in Padua when Conradin, he met at least with him as Conradin was going towards southern Italy to triumph and death and defeat at the same time. And Conradin sort of told him what to do in Swabia, essentially. A brother of Rudolf had died in the service of Frederick II in the wars against the Lombard League. Just imagine this man. I mean, randomly, you look at all the story of the Battle of Markfeld, and you think Rudolf's brother had died fighting against, the Guelphs in Italy. I mean, what did that mean to him? When, as an old man, by the way, he fought at Markfeld and almost was killed there himself. Like, it's these dimensions that I personally always found extremely fascinating. And I want really to bring Schwerpunkt to this level of depth whenever we reflect about these figures. And so again, this is it. The political conflict ultimately centered on 2 figures of immense historical importance who succeeded in channeling the centrifugal forces tearing apart the German kingdom. Ottokar II, Přemysl, I could say simply Přemysl, but I like, there's few, I can't speak in this sense. king of Bohemia, who between 1251 and 1269, throughout the annexation, say annexation is too big, but say at least the taking over of Austria, Carinthia and Carniola, because we're talking, of course, this is not a 19th century state that takes over another incorporated. It's always a feudal position, right? As individual, in fact, Duke of Austria's. By the way, I made, as I was saying before, some videos about Austria's, Carinthia, Carniola. Carniola I haven't, but Carinthia, yes. Styria as well. He became the most powerful prince in the empire and aimed to establish a vast Slavic dominion in Central Europe, or at least, Bohemia was to unavoidably become that. It wasn't much about the Slavic dimension to it solely, because, again, we said it before, and we'll see it better in the following episodes. Ottokar was very much of a Germanizing ruler. In order to aspire to himself to the imperial crown, he was very much in need of German support. At the Battle of Markfeld, he died surrounded by his Saxon knights, right? While he had led basically the Bohemians and the Moravians being butchered by the enemy in the first line. We will see that better. And there is no doubt, however, that was a Slavic pride of these rulers, in that, of course, Bohemia, as you know, had these two majorly important moments in history, in medieval history. That was under Ottokar II, that became literally, I think, the guy, in fact, who wrote that ruled the largest amount of territories ever that every single ruler had ruled in the Holy Roman Empire. Up to that point. That's insane. And we'll understand also why. Because it's obviously a combination of resources. Ottokar was a great ruler in general, too. The other is, of course, Luxembourg, Bohemia, so the 14th century most. And so we're not that far away, but there is a continuity, of course, and Bohemia had its own characteristics we will see better now. And consider size rather than quality also, or at least together with quality, matters. And we'll see it more now, because, again, we will dedicate entire videos individually just to Ottokar and Rudolf, respectively. And count, in fact, Rudolf IV of Habsburg, because he is you have to be precise in medieval history with the actual numbering, because he was Rudolf IV as Count of Habsburg, right? Then he had other titles as Duke, say, of Swabia, of Austria, and then Rudolf I of Germany, all right? He had a relatively minor figure compared to the formidable Rex Aureus et Ferreus. Ottokar was dubbed, in fact, the Golden and Iron King for the cultural and economic prosperity of Bohemia under his rule and his daring military victories against the Hungarians, 1254-1260, and the Prussians in the Baltic regions, 1254-1267, and 1268. Ottokar himself had dismissed Rudolf as a poor count, right? And this will play along, because the way sources end up framing Ottokar, because there isn't much from the Bohemian side, sources-wise, but the entire story that eventually was resumed again in the age of Romanticism, of the great opera of the 19th century, is the notion of Ottokar as so we could say the pagan, powerful ruler that just pursues glory and ambition and material things, etc. And instead, Rudolf is the guy who emerges just out of mere spirit and succeeds, even though he didn't care so much about wealth, mostly because he didn't have it, by the way. But indeed, you can project this on the times as well, because Ottokar was, the Přemyslims were just like, I don't know, the Arpads, the PS, but some of the greatest dynasties in Europe historically were incredibly old. They had pioneered properly the national history of their people throughout the stormy waters of the High Middle Ages. It's a big deal, all right? In fact, I made some videos about Bohemia, early Bohemian history, telling about the origin of the Přemyslids as well. And so imagine this guy, we know from historical records, at some point met with Rudolf. We'll read this better. In some occasions, Rudolf had, even as king of the Romans, a very simple outfit, and Ottokar was his vassal as king of Bohemia, but he was covered in armor, precious stones, this incredibly costly attire, etc. So that Rudolf basically humiliated this guy by presenting him like that and saying, "I'm less than you." Say, yeah, because the Count of Habsburg was elected, as we'll see now, by the German princes mistakenly in the wake of in the vest of a poor, or at least a weak in the sense, ruler. Instead, he rose to massive prominence. Also to counter Ottokar, and that's why he initially had the German backing, because Ottokar had been overly expanding in the east and in the same southeastern Germany. And so that's where mostly the showdown, as you know, will occur. But it's all kind of complex, because at some point Rudolf was abandoned by the same Germans. Right? He had to make it out of all of it by himself, basically. And here I write, nonetheless, Rudolf was selected by the electoral princes as king of the Romans to restore order to the disordered territories of the Holy Roman Empire and reassert its authority in Italy. The rivalry between these two rulers escalated into a gripping and dramatic sequence of political and military confrontations, culminating in a 2-year war that concluded on the battlefield of Markfeld in Lower Austria on August 26, 1278. The ramifications of this confrontation, though not fully understood at the time, would fundamentally alter the course of European and global history, which is absolutely true. And so this was this was titled Historical Background in my thesis. And again, it's fairly simple because I wanted to skip chit-chat, but I had to make some of it anyway. It's unavoidable. When you look at, say, the work is needed, at least. It was beautiful for me, as I said, just to start from the general and ending up in the very specific. But it's also like there was a lot of information I could discuss regarding the entire background. As we will see, the chapters about Rudolf and Ottokar are much heftier and sort of really telling of lots of other things that, by the way, are not even that relevant to the battle, because this was a military history thesis, all in all. It was an exercise of method and of analysis. And it's, in fact, I should point out that this is the Battle of Markfeld is the first battle that I fully reconstructed through the entire amount of sources available. And believe me, this is not a child's play, meaning that if we're talking, again, the ancient world, yes, there are those couple of sources, and that's basically it. You can say other things, you can cross different, you can make all your philological, linguistical, archaeological inquiry, etc., but more or less what we're told about the major battles, I would say, of the Persian wars, of the Roman Civil War, it's basically that, right? There is not much beating around the bush when you have to explain that. You can't add that much. With the Middle Ages, it's different, because in this case, at least, I had, as I said before, a pretty advanced historiography already existing on the battle that sort of limited my original expansion. It was obviously difficult to add something new. I had the opportunity, again, to simply look at different things that were relevant to the clash as well, that other scholars had not observed. I presume, probably the first military historian after a long time to have at least properly looked at the battle from a merely to write about the battle and the campaign from a military historical point of view in terms of strategic analysis, tactical reconstruction, and so on. It's also not entirely clear what was actually happening during this campaign, while for example, Ottokar would basically advance towards Markfeld. So that's a bit of an unsolved mystery. If it wasn't for the normal factors that normally would make you pressure and advance. In any case, the broader sense of the picture, I would say, lays in the in the fact of of how complex a 13th century battle can be from the sources, from properly untranslated medieval vernacular, from certain, from the complexity of the records of certain, I don't know, you reconstruct a battle studying obituaries at the end, or again, looking at the battlefield, yes, but mostly inquiring the sources, their background, why they were saying what they were saying, what is that they were focusing mostly on. It's not a radically difficult battle to reconstruct, but to study the campaign that leads up to it, you must make a huge effort of source collection and analysis that at the time was incredibly educational. It helped me a great deal also as far as the doctorate was concerned, because I would end up doing the same, mostly tactics, because I said after the campaign of Markville, oh my God, if it takes so much just for the campaign, okay, let's just look to the battles. And also that's why I specialize further into tactics, right? But overall, right, the picture is indeed one of, let's say, a fair battle in complexity that you have to, if anything, if you have never handled tens of sources while reconstructing battles, you learn how to methodologically adapt to that, right? You have to read them all in parallel, you have to understand what they say in Latin, you have to become acquainted with particular terms that you hadn't seen before, you have to evaluate the likelihood of finding this way or that way. You see, up to that point myself, because it's not like I had a degree in military history ever, right? I studied properly medieval history plus history of religions, anthropology, all this stuff. And the general sense of a battle like this was, of writing a thesis of this kind, was also to properly get acquainted with the practice of warfare. I mean, the Battle of Markfield, for example, was of incredible importance for me just to understand how 13th century battles were fought. These were the largest feudal battles of the Middle Ages, and so they offered so much. That's why I insist very much on this. The most important ones were easily Benevent, Tagliacozzo, and Markfield, right? And in the others were smaller. We've seen Bouvines was smaller, right? So there is a level of complexity, especially for a battle fought in Central Europe. You can't properly check. There are so many different issues with, for example, the infantry. We know that the infantry was there, but none of the sources talk about that. Can you believe that? In combat, like how were they used, whatever. Then, however, like also, for example, articles that I came to publish recently, etc., that were quite groundbreaking for also very important battles that were basically as completely misunderstood by historiography. It may seem strange by 2025, but so here we are. For the major and Middle Ages, I came to correctly reconstruct. I can't say thanks to my thesis, my master thesis, but I had started figuring out how this whole thing worked by habit through the thesis that I used. And when I wrote this, I didn't have all the experience I have now, because I reconstructed seriously tens of battles in the same way. Even on Schwerpunkt, whenever I could put my hands on specific accounts, etc., as we've seen, that's how we develop the thing, right? So on YouTube, it's very different, but I came to really write about a lot. Just I told you that I started a book that is not about battle per se. It's a military history of a place. But because I just finished writing an article about battles that we'll publish next year. And so it's all consequential, right? And when I wrote the thesis, for a while, before reconstructing other battles, I stuck to this magnificent experience of Markfield because of all what I said at the beginning as the meter of how a battle is. And so I haven't seen other battles in comparison for me to say, well, that's how, okay, we would essentially imagine others would be fought. So I had an idea that eventually had to remold, because every battle is, if anything, different. And so there is always, I mean, everything is kind of similar, but there are also always unique elements to it. And so there is never there's always something more that you add to your baggage to as a tool to say, okay, when I studied yet another battle, I can't use all these tools that I saw in previous battles to say, maybe this happened. And everything becomes ever easier to reconstruct. And this was my first step. And so that's why I'm so, again, moved to make a video like this. Because it really talks to this chord of my historical experience. Besides, again, aside from the strictly military side of the story, I can't deny that I enjoyed dramatically the entire context. I mean, making a work like this really makes you very aware of the entire region, its military culture in that generation and beyond, because you're able to see things just in ways that another context wouldn't offer you. And so again, it goes on, and eventually you become just sort of do almost justice. And so everything acquires sort of another light of some sort, and you become ever more, let's say, thankful even for having had the opportunity of doing all this. And frankly, Schwerpunkt owes to this thesis a lot. As I explained at the beginning, it was such a legendary time for me, and I wish I still was back then to a degree, because of course now you would know what to do in so many circumstances. You would, but again, the myth of simply coming back and doing things better remains a myth. In fact, in as much as you would change reality also in ways that you wouldn't be able to eventually contemplate the consequences of. So, as Phil Clausewitz says, once you're on a track, unless it's completely disastrous, stick to it, right? Even when things, and especially when things get tough. And so that's also what life is at the end of the day. And so again, I'm very thankful for everything I've done here, and what you see in the channel is a great deal of also what I matured through writing this thesis, and I hope that you can enjoy this series as much as I do, and I did in writing my thesis in particular. So that's it. Again, maybe not an overwhelming introduction, because I would expect something like 2 hours and a half or something like that, but we will get there, don't worry. And that's also why I had to break it down into this various different chunks, because I said, now I will read 17 pages straight of, 10, just for the first chapter of like Times New Roman 10 size font, just for the first chapter, all compact, without layout, without anything, like without spacing. Well, okay, let's try to split things. It's just like, this video is just like 1 page and a half. All right. So that's how I'm habituated to do things. There's always like the overburnt kind of, like once I publish maybe the 20th episode, you will say, oh, please stop doing this. But, we will sort of evenly distribute this with the proper ratio. And if anything, I use these are technically specials. I've been increasing the amounts of specials in some ways to stiffen the, especially also the views, etc., in different type of circumstances. And I hope that it really helps, because it's always a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it. And we're probably going to follow very much like an interesting path in the next period, and it has its toll. But I would say that it's okay. We're not scared of doing this. I'm waiting for September to be a bit more of a productive time, because that's usually how things happen in over the year. September, October usually are the top months for some reason, up until like eventually there is a gradual descent until February, March, and ups and downs until summer that is usually low. But you may never know, because it's not always the same word, it's not always the same thing. We are, if anything, I was hinting at this at the very beginning, we're going to cover a major gap into, I think, what is not just not much Schwerpunkt, I would say, Schwerpunkt content, but also probably YouTube in general, because as we said here, it's the history essentially of Germany, it's of Austria even in some ways, but it's bigger than that, of Bohemia, of Hungary, even of northeastern Italy. It's this is so far-ranging, because Ottokar arrived up to the Baltic. There were some Ruthenian noblemen involved in the sphere. There are the Mongols. Okay, the Mongols are out of the way, but let's say that there is a lot of there are the Cumans. There is a broader alliance between Ottokar and Charles of Anjou as Sicily. We'll see now also what the Swabians were doing. The Hohenstaufen were basically Alsatian, and so there is also a French dimension. There are the Savoyards. In any case, everything mostly revolves around southeastern Germany and Bohemia and Hungary, and so that sphere we have made lots of videos about the single countries, but we haven't created a bridge proper to connect the wall, right? So here I was just checking Studio on YouTube. For example, how much did we do about Hungary? Not so much, all right? Medieval Hungary, only like 18 videos, right? It's a fair amount overall, but we should have made like out of 5 or 6, I don't know. By this point, there's more about Bohemia, I think, paradoxically, even though it's smaller. Yep, medieval Bohemia 26. Well, this was kind of slightly better, but we could have made more. Really, we need more, and this series will allow us that. I don't think we have a series, a playlist about medieval Austria, have we? Because we haven't made specifically. Yep, we have 24 videos about Austrian history, but mostly revolving around Vienna. But for example, we made a very few about the Habsburg, and that's why we never really made a video about, I don't know, Rudolf himself. We made a video about multiple videos about Charles IV of Bohemia, for example. Also, never made a video about Ottokar per se. So this is going to be incredibly important as a series, because it will tie so many different things, and it's not like even Germany. If you think about it, especially the second half of the 13th century, there isn't much about that. You may not notice these things, because again, about medieval Germany made like, I don't know, more than 100 videos. But overall, there are all these gaps to bridge that I'm becoming almost obsessed with, considering the sort of the general circumstance. Again, it's somehow difficult to look at this in proper terms, but yeah, we're getting there, and we have to absolutely talk more and more and more and more about this. We made something more about the Habsburgs in general in the last couple of years. I'm very proud of this. We have 34 videos about the Habsburgs. And again, it's mostly modern history. That's why it's crucial, it's imperative to talk about the the medieval Habsburgs more. Because they pass as those guys who took forever to create a functional power. But actually, at the time of Rudolf and Albert, the Habsburgs were overwhelmingly powerful in Europe. They were enormously powerful. They already reached basically the levels that we remember them all during the Renaissance. Then, of course, things ended, and things also kicked in as far as the crisis was concerned, and of the great medieval civilization. But this is the paradox of Germany. It collapses as a national monarchy in the peak of medieval civilization. It's very weird, but also confers this particular characteristics to the same. So again, we're going to make more and more content on this topic. And for the rest, you are absolutely aware that I stick to this content. I probably, when I go on vacations, you will not see that, as you haven't seen it in the past, as a matter of fact. But I will keep you well fed, especially at this point where I can't really have reserves. It's a bit of a hard work, but it's worth it, because especially in September, or at least in other important times, it's important not to sort of go down rhythm-wise. Again, we'll have fun in the next series, in next episodes of the series, and on Schwerpunkt in general. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.